What is your go-to method of progression for isolation lifts? Usually I'll add reps. And this kind of goes for a lot of stuff. Like I'm a big fan. I like to keep it simple in terms of like just double progression for most movements. Um, so progressing reps before load. So I'll give a rep range. And once you get to the top end of the rep range, for a given set or across your sets, you can increase load for that set or for all the sets. So there's a couple ways you can go about that. Like you can kind of start your first set a little bit submaximal, and so a lot of my athletes are probably familiar. Like I might program like 4-to-1 RIR. So the initial set is easier, but then you try to replicate reps across each set. So the last set's generally more difficult, and or it gets progressively more difficult. And then with the progression there, it's like once you hit the top end of the rep range, that you would increase load after that. So I find, especially like when we train, there's different adaptive rates, for each kind of adaptation that we're seeking. And I do find, especially as with more advanced athletes, like using rep progression can, at least anecdotally, seems to kind of be my weapon of choice before increasing load rather than increasing load and letting reps come down. Now there's situations where, I'll still do that, especially if there's like strength, focused goals involved, but keeping people healthy and kind of just giving their joints a more like graded exposure to the load, and like doing one additional rep is oftentimes going to be a little bit less taxing there than doing, you know, 5 to 10 extra pounds for the same amount of reps. So I tend to, add reps before load for a lot of things, not all, but a lot. And, isolation movements, especially because generally the poundages, that you're using for those are going to be lower in general. And, like a minimal increase, like 2.5 pounds or 5 pounds is like a pretty large relative increase. So if you do go with load progression on something like lateral raises, and I think Eric Helms and I were talking about this on the last podcast, if I recall, but sometimes for something like a lateral raise, like if you find you're increasing reps or increasing weight because you hit the top end of the rep range and then you fall below the low end of the rep range, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Just widen your rep range a bit. Or if you feel your shoulders a little bit achy using that load, you can just keep climbing in reps. So you can either increase the ceiling of the rep range or you can lower the floor of the rep range. So it's like hypertrophy is pretty flexible in that regard.